So for those who maybe haven't ever seen or used NetPoint before, I'm going to start from the start and just take you through some of the fundamentals of NetPoint schedule development. The first thing to know is that NetPoint is a time scale, and you control how big the time scale is by setting the schedule calendar. And you can find that under schedule, modify schedule properties, and you can set the dates. Now, when you set the dates, you can set a time unit, so you can go by day or hour or minute. We have clients who sometimes plan out 10 years in advance for their programs, and they usually plan by the quarter, sometimes even by the month, so they can get everything on one page. We have other folks who are trying to optimize a process, and they might use a minute in their time scale. But we're going to stick with a day for today. We also have the option to do Ordinal Starts, so you don't have the actual months up there, just numbers for the periods. And then you get to the calendar dates. So this is a 2-year schedule, a 1.5 year schedule. And then within that, you have the project start and the project finish. And those have to be within the calendar. Usually we try to slide them in a month or two in to give you a little bit of planning room on each end. And the one thing to note is you don't want your calendar to be a lot longer than your anticipated project. And the reason for that is because as you're drawing the plan on the canvas, the calendar is going to determine how much space you have to plan. So for instance, if you have a 2-year plan and a 4-year calendar, you're not using half of your canvas. So you're going to end up kind of crowded in one spot. So try to maintain your calendar dates relatively close within a few months of your anticipated schedule time. And you can always change that later if you need to add. Taking calendar away can be problematic if you're running into activities that are already in that space, but you can always add. So once you've established how long your project is going to be and how long it's going to take to finish and when you're going to start, the next thing to decide is how big is your piece of paper going to be when you print it out. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but NetPoint is actually really a WYSIWYG tool. And so WYSIWYG standing for what you see is what you get. And so if you choose an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper to plan on, that's what's going to print out, 8.5 by 11. If you choose ANSI E-sized plot, it's going to be a much bigger canvas. And the problem comes if you try to print an ANSI E-sized plot onto an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. Now, I know in future development that we're going to emancipate the printer from the screen. And Dr. Vivek, I think, is working hard on that as we speak. But for now, you got to focus on what size you want the print out to be. And so we'll just go to an Adobe printout here. And right now it's set for letter, but I'm going to make it bigger just so you can see. You see here the slide bar, I have a little bit of room vertically and no room horizontally. And if I change this to the ledger size, which is, is that 11 by, no, it's 22 by, I don't remember. Anyway, bigger than 8.5 by 11. So now you can see I have a lot more room on this slide bar. My canvas has gotten bigger and I have a little bit more room on this slide bar. So you can see that changing the size of the page changes the size of the canvas. And so these are a few of the setups, the fundamentals you have to look at when you're starting a NetPoint plan. Focus on how long is my project going to be and how big is my printout going to be. And I can tell you that very early on in the development of NetPoint, we were using a different system to track where objects were on the page, and we were using pixels. And it turns out that different densities of pixels on printouts and on screens were actually moving objects. So that was an early lesson learned shall we say, a little redo action. But we updated that long, long ago. So the fundamentals of NetPoint, you're trying to build a schedule, and we have this logic diagram method, LDM, to draw on the canvas. So when you want to start a new activity, you click on the activity button up here in the ribbon, and then you select your start date. You can see here that you have the crosshairs, and the crosshairs are the date that you're on. That tells you the date and the day of the week. And you can see that sometimes that day of the week changes color, and that's because it's a non-working day. A non-working day will be red, and a working day will be black, and that depends on the calendar that you're using. So in this case, for instance, if we get off the thing, when we get here, we have Easter on this calendar. This is your holiday line, and Memorial Day, kind of keep track of that. I remember we were working in China with NetPoint, and we had the Chinese calendar, but not being local, we didn't have all the holidays correct. And I can remember being kind of, I don't know, jabbed in the ribs a little bit by the locals saying, oh, you think this is a Chinese calendar, huh? Well, live and learn. We improved it from there. So you line up your activity start, and then you click your button on the mouse and start dragging to the right. And you can see the duration is extending out. The dates for start and finish are there. And when you let go of your mouse, then it gives you the opportunity to put in a description. So I'm gonna just say permits, because we always start with permits. Okay, so now we have this one activity on the screen floating around. What if I need to adjust it after I've created it? It's really not a problem. You can select it, and then once you've selected it and you see your arrows switch to that back and forth arrow that's in the middle of that node, then you can start dragging it back or forward. You can also change its location on the grid. For instance, let's say we decide we want to bring this down 2 grids. You can just use your arrow key once it's selected. And if you want your grids to be smaller or bigger, you can adjust those with this little tiny gray button on the left. Any grid will do. So grab that. Now we've made the grid smaller, which gives you more opportunity to put more activities on the screen. So we have one activity here. It's floating out there in the middle of space, and it looks a little lonely, so we're going to add a new one. We'll add a clear site. So now we have 2 activities. They look like they are on the same horizontal plane, which is something you can do in NetPoint that you can't do with other tools, because this is a active, live, interactive canvas. It's not a database that's being driven like into a waterfall kind of a look, like you would get in other tools. So now we have these 2 activities, and what's interesting is you can grab this clear site, for instance, and you can move it over here, and it doesn't have any effect on permits, which is right, because they're not connected yet. So what if we were to do a finish to start relationship between these 2? I'm just going to draw a box there. That's going to select both of them. And then I'm going to use this linking tool here. Just click the button, and now they're linked. So what happens if permits gets delayed? And it's going to start pushing clear site. And you can imagine that with a larger schedule, you can get some unintended or unintended or even like unseeable interactions between different activities in the network. When you move one, something else is going to adjust in the page. And that's part of what is very helpful in doing an interactive planning session with NetPoint, is the ability to do that. Now, by default, when you start a NetPoint plan, your calculations for criticality, which are here in modify schedule properties, they're going to go to total float, which is float plus drift. And for those of you who are uninitiated with GPM and NetPoint, I'm going to let Dr. Vivek chime in here and talk just for a few minutes about what drift is and what float is and how they are a little bit different than CPM.
Thank you, Tim. So the idea of float is similar to that we have in CPM algorithms. So float is basically the ability of an activity to delay its start up to the point that it starts delaying the project end, the duration that you can delay the activity start. In this particular case, GPM allows another property called drift, and drift is the complete opposite of float, which is how early can you move the start of an activity without affecting the project start instead. So in this particular case, clear site can definitely move earlier. It can be started earlier, as early as probably April 3rd, without really pushing the project start earlier. But once you push it earlier than April 3rd, then it will push permits to start earlier and thereby pushing the project to start earlier.
Let's do that. You can see as ClearSite moves, now it's pushing permits. Permits is pushing the project start date. And you can see here too that now we have zero drift. This number on the left is drift. This one is float, and this one is total float. And in GPM, the sum of float and drift is total float, because that's how much you can move the activity without affecting the project, either the start or the finish. This is a very helpful feature for resource leveling. If you need to move something a little bit to the left, so maybe split an activity, you can do that with NetPoint. And this is very different than CPM-based tools in that we always use a plan date. So any date between the early date and the late date, you can drop an activity on the calendar or on the canvas, and that activity will sit there and not move until you move it, or you move something in the logic that makes it move. Whereas in CPM-based tools, when you hit F9 or it recalculates, it's going to slide things back to the early date. So you couldn't have this gap here of 17 days between permits and clear site unless you constrain the start date of clear site. And we let you do that if you want to. You can come down here and say start no earlier than. And now you'll see there's a little exclamation point here, which is giving you a warning that you have a start no earlier date there. And now if I try to move clear site to the left, it doesn't move, and it doesn't move because it's constrained. Dr. Vivek is going to give during our advanced talk, he's going to give a tutorial on how to interact with P6 and NetPoint. And sometimes people use the constraint to keep something from moving to the left once it's recalculated in P6. So you can see now that we have 0 days of drift because permits is starting directly on project start, 232 days of total float. And if we were to grab, I have to move my video here for a second. Maybe I can't move my video. Pardon my stumbling here for a second. Okay, I'm gonna go grab my project completion and watch the float and total float numbers as I start to move this over. You can see that everything recalculates in real time, which is really cool. It's a unique feature of NetPoint. So once this goes past 17 days, it's gonna turn critical. And why are there still 17 days when obviously this is late? And it's because you have 17 days of drift here. Clear site can still move back 17 days without affecting project start. Now it's critical, but it looks like it's just 1 day off. So if we go off to the edge there, then suddenly not critical. So The fundamentals in NetPoint, let's just rehash those, because that's what you do with fundamentals. You just say them over and over. You want to determine your calendar size. You want to determine your page size. And you should probably think about how you want to calculate your criticality. So remember, that's under schedule properties right here in criticality factor and criticality threshold. Obviously, in a 2-year project, you probably don't want your criticality threshold to be 0. You know, maybe a week or 2 would make more sense. And depending on how you're planning, you may want to switch to just float versus float and drift. I may have steered you a little wrong earlier when I said you have to drag the mouse to the right. You can drag the mouse to the left too. So let's say I want to add fencing to this. Not the Olympic sport, but fencing to protect people from getting onto the site. So we'll call it fencing. And you notice that I dragged that to the left. So you can plan backwards from the end date to the start date. You can plan from the start to the end, or you can plan in the middle. And part of what this does is it gives you the opportunity in an interactive planning session to talk to folks without having to be constrained. You know, someone can say, oh, I have this idea. Let's not forget that we have to put in fencing. And you can just add fencing right in the middle. You can add even after you've created this. So let's add fencing here, and we'll link these two up. And now that that's linked in there, it could become a driver and push clear site and permits, or they could push fencing, either way. You can see here we've got a little bit of unattractive clashing between the project or the activity end date and the activity start date. And so usually what I do for that is if I have a 0 gap chain of activities, I'll turn off one of the two, either the finish or the start. And so you could do that just by double clicking on the activity itself and go to the properties and display and turn off the finish date. Or another alternative is you can select the activity or a group of activities and then go to objects and set objects, selected properties, yikes. And I'm going to turn off the finish date on this one as well. These are 3-way switches, which I always find confusing in my house. I don't know if any of you have these, but you walk in and you hit a button and nothing happens. So you have to go to some other part of the house and hit a different button for it to turn on. So it's kind of like that. So if it's checkboxed, that means it's definitely going to be on. If it's got a dash through it, it means no change. And if it's blank, that means you're turning it off. So that's the secret code inside of NetPoint. So now you can see this actually looks a lot nicer without those dates running over each other. So what if we need to move fencing so that it starts after we start clearing the site, but we don't want to wait till the end of clear site to do that. So right now, fencing is connected. Sorry about that. Fencing is connected to clear site with a logic tie, and you can see that logic tie here. So I'm going to select that logic tie and break it by hitting delete. And then I'm going to move fencing to the left, and I'm going to put a start embed. What is a start embed? Well, it's another unique feature of NetPoint. The functionality here is that if you want to do a start to start or a finish to finish relationship within NetPoint, you can use these embeds. And graphically, it's a lot easier for the eye to follow than other methods of doing those kinds of connections. So let's link those together. So now fencing is going to start someplace in clear site, but how can we know where in clear site? Well, we have a gap of 8 days. You could also change that to be different type of node, but we're just going to put that 8-day lag in there. There we go. And now fencing could actually become a driver to the project start. If you try to move fencing back too far, it's going to start pushing the rest of the network. And so you can see this is a full live network, but we're just drawing it. It's an easy thing to grasp. Now, you can see we have 174 days of float. And let's add one more activity here. We're going to add foundation. I was driving by a big construction site the other day, and I mean, it was more than 2 acres. And they had it all these kind of pipes and utilities and stuff sticking up out of the ground where they were putting in a slab foundation. It was pretty interesting to see. And think of all the planning you'd have to do to get that in place. If only they had NetPoint, it could have gone so much better for them. But here we're going to link these two together now. And let's prove that they're linked. Yep, they're definitely linked. So another way you could tell they're linked is to turn on the float here. So let's turn that on. And you can see that we've gone from 119 days of float here to 114 days of float here. And that's an indication that these two are linked. Because if this weren't linked, let's do that. Let's unlink it. So now you can see this is a larger number. So if you see some anomalies in your float calculations, check your linking. That's usually one of the basis. Another problem could be that you've changed calendars, one activity to the next, and so your float calculations don't look quite right. That's been a standard in our training classes to give people a diagram to rebuild and to mess with the calendars. Okay, so now we have this group of activities, and I'm gonna just turn off my Teams, which seems to be acting up. So now we have these activities, we have all this float. What if we were to call this phase 1? So we want this to be phase 1 of our project. I'm gonna select all these activities and create a hammock, which is this one right here. And I'm going to put that hammock on grid 4. And I'm going to call it phase 1. Okay. So now, if anything changes in the activities here, then phase 1 is going to follow along with that. And that's a nice way to kind of highlight another level of the plan. You can, if your plan's getting crowded, but you still want to retain that detail, you can hide the fragment under a grid. So now it just says phase 1. Then you can show it again. And there's your detail. We have a pretty unique object in NetPoint called a benchmark. We have a finish and a start benchmark. For those of you who are P6 aficionados, it would be like a double constrained milestone. Is that what they call it, Vivek? Double constrained?
A must on, basically.
A what?
A must on.
Must on. I like that. All right, a must on. So I'm going to go ahead and add a finished benchmark here. At least I think I am. And I'll put it right there and call it end phase 1. Wow, that's big. I had no idea I'd set that to be so big, but that's good. I mean, highlights the importance of this benchmark. So now I'm going to link the end of foundation to this benchmark. And you can see that something strange has happened to our float calculations. We've lost our float. We're down to 11 days, which I'm guessing if I look at this here, we're going to see that the gap between the end of foundation and the end of phase 1 is 11 days. So now you can see that one of the really useful things you can do with a benchmark is terminate float. Because if you don't capture the float as in phase 1, maybe phase 1 uses all the float for the whole project. And phase 2 and phase 3 are not going to be very happy about that. So this is a way to build the network and terminate float. Now, maybe you want to highlight the fact that this is phase 1. So we're going to throw a little shade on it, as they say, and the kids say, and we're going to put a shade here. Just highlight that as phase 1. You can add a shade any way you want. You can make swim lanes. You can highlight something on the screen as you're talking. This particular shade is still active object on the canvas, so you can move it around, which seems nice. But believe me, if you're doing an interactive planning session with NetPoint, you're going to want to highlight that and you want to change it to a canvas background. So now that it's a canvas background, you can't just grab it and move it, which you'll be grateful for, because when you try to grab fencing and move it, you're going to grab the background instead and move it, and mayhem will ensue. We haven't talked about some of the additional cool functions you can add into the NetPoint canvas. For instance, text boxes are super helpful. You could say, for instance, let's see, with 5 crews expected. So while you're doing the interactive planning session, you can say, okay, well, this is my duration here, but I'm expecting 5 crews. And if only 3 crews show up, this is going to be longer. So it's a great way of kind of documenting things on the canvas while you're working with folks and putting assumptions in. And these text boxes, you have full control over, font size and things like that. So that's super handy. There we go. That's a little better. You can also link to objects off the canvas. For instance, let's say that you had a safety plan or a site picture or drawings that you wanted to reference during the planning session. You can use one of these information objects, and you drop that onto the canvas and then link it to a file. And let's just find one. Denver Airport. Yeah, sure. So now we're going to have this Denver Airport picture linked into our canvas. And when I click on it, it will pop up. And it did, in fact, pop up on my other screen. Another thing you can do is you can add an object directly to an activity. So for instance, if you go to Info Objects and the properties of an activity, you can add files and attach them with the activity, and then they will travel with that activity as it goes around. You can also annotate activity, and that's under the properties here. So let me grab that. So Vivek, I might need your help here. I'm having trouble finding my annotation.
At the bottom part.
Oh, thank you. And add your annotation at start, center, or finish. So we'll do it at the start, and we'll just draw a little box here. We'll draw. I guess I'm gonna have to do this again. I'm a little off on my mouse today, I think, because my computer isn't quite in the usual spot. There we go. And so we'll say should be 2 inches or whatever annotation you want. So now you have the annotation there. And if you move foundation, then the annotation moves with it, which isn't true of a text box. The text box will always just sit wherever you put it. So that's a handy feature to use as well. And let's, we're going to be wrapping up here for questions in just a few minutes, but let's talk about milestones as well. It's another important building block of a multi-level graphic schedule that you'll be developing in NetPoint. So a milestone is different than a benchmark in that it floats with whatever it's connected to. So I've just selected a finish milestone here. And you can tell it's a finished milestone partly because it says finished milestone when you put a mouse over it, but also because we have this coding system where a start activity is colored in on the left and a finish activity is colored in on the right. And that's true on these benchmarks, true on embeds as well. So that's a little secret code that we have in NetPoint. So I'm going to do this, say, end phase 1. So now we have this milestone floating out there, but it's not connected to anything. So I'm going to connect it to, oh, I have to select first. I'm going to connect it to the end of foundation. And that should get us a tracking milestone to the end of phase 1. Okay, so there's the end of phase 1. And now if foundation starts to move out a little bit, you can see this milestone is going to float with it, as is the hammock. So what we've got here really is a 3-level schedule that we created. It's a drawing. It's easy to follow, but at the same time, it is a real mathematical model of a schedule. As a matter of fact, if we do a right mouse click here, oops, I'm a little off here. Let's do.
On the white portion you're getting for the background.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Vivek. See, this is why it's so important to have Vivek on with me. He's saving my life. So you can display the schedule statistics here. And you can see, it counts how many activities, what your redundant link count is. I have no redundant links, by the way. Excellent scheduler. And project duration, all the mathematical things. And you can send this out to Excel. So there's just a ton of functionality here.